Today I'm turning some plain little thrifted curtain rings into the sweetest upcycled hangers, tags, ornaments or bowl fillers. I love a project like this because it's simple. It uses something that could easily be overlooked and it gives those little forgotten bits and pieces a completely new purpose. So to start off, I made sure all of my curtain rings were nice and clean. These were just plain natural timber ones, so they didn't really have much colour or age to them. Sometimes you can find the curtain rings that have already got the gorgeous deep brown vintage look, and if you do, you can absolutely leave them as they are. But these ones were a little bit too new looking for the style I wanted, so I decided to give them a little makeover. Once they were clean, I gave each a really good sand with 120 grit sandpaper, sanding just enough to open the pores of the wood to let the stain sink in. After sanding, I wiped them all down really well to remove any sanding dust. You don't want all of that dusty residue sitting there when you're about to stain or seal. Next, I used Dixie Belle Tobacco Road with a damp chucks cloth and wiped it over each curtain ring. I love using a cloth for this sort of thing because it gives me a bit more control. I can build the colour up slowly and still let some of that timber show through underneath. I wasn't trying to make them look perfect. In fact, I wanted the opposite. I wanted them to look a little aged, a little time worn, and like they'd been tucked away in an old sewing basket or hanging in a little cottage somewhere. So I just worked the stain around the timber, making sure I got into the edges and around the sides. Once they were stained, I dried them off and with my heat gun. After they were dry, I went back in with my 120 grit sandpaper and distressed them. Then I went ahead and sealed them with clear wax. Clear wax is perfect for this because it doesn't make them look shiny or new. It just keeps everything soft and subtle. Then I moved on to the little fabric inserts. I used some calico for this because it has a beautiful natural texture and it works so well with stamps. It's simple, neutral, and gives that lovely handmade feel without overpowering the rest of the project. I used the IOD stamp called Song and Shade and some stone grey ink, but first of all I went about and just decided which stamps I was going to use inside each of the curtain rings. I wanted something a little soft and simple, almost like little botanical sketches. Nothing too bold because these are only small pieces and I didn't want the design to feel too heavy. So to get the right size, I basically traced the inside of each of the curtain rings, but I sort of put my pencil in further in the center to give a larger circle so that it would fit nicely on the back of each of the curtain rings. Once I had the circles traced out, I cut them out with scissors. Again, not to panic if they're not perfect or they're a little bit too big because you can always cut them back. Then it was time for the stamping. I used my IOD stamp Shade and Song and stone grey ink to stamp some little leafy details onto the calico. I wanted something soft and simple, almost like little botanical sketches. Nothing too bold because these are only small pieces and I didn't want to make the design feel too heavy. When you're stamping onto fabric, it helps to make sure your fabric is nice and flat and taut, that you press evenly over each of the stamps. You don't want to press too hard because then you will end up making the image blurry. I stamped a different little leafy detail onto each piece of calico so they all looked like they belonged together but weren't exactly the same. That's one of my favourite things with these handmade pieces. They don't have to be identical. In fact, I think they're so much sweeter when each one has its own tiny bit of character. Once the calico was glued down all the way around, I trimmed off any excess from the fabric at the back. You don't need to be too precious here because the back isn't really the star of the show, but I still like to tidy things up nicely. Then came the pretty finishing touches. I used a gorgeous cream velvet ribbon to make little looped hangers for each one. I thought the velvet worked beautifully with the aged timber and the soft calico. It adds a little bit of prettiness without being too much. I cut a piece of ribbon for each hanger, looped it through the metal hook at the top of the curtain ring and then tied it in place. You could use twine, lace, seam binding, torn fabric, or whatever you have in your stash, but I really love the softness of the velvet with this one. Then I made a little matching bow for each one and glued it into place at the top. The bow just finished them off and makes them feel a little bit more special. It gives them that sweet handmade cottage style look, which you know I'm always going to be drawn to. And that's really all there is to it. A few plain curtain rings, a little stain, some calico, pretty stamp and a bit of ribbon, and they become these gorgeous little upcycled decorations. I think these would be beautiful used in so many different ways. You could hang them on little hooks, peg them onto baskets, tie them onto a gift bag, or use them as a special handmade gift tag. They'd be lovely added to Christmas gifts, Mother's Day gifts, birthday presents, or even just wrapped around a little bunch of flowers. You can find pieces like this along with lots of other handmade, vintage inspired and upcycled treasures in store at Raggedy Bits Emporium or online at raggedy-bits.com. And don't forget to follow along for more fun DIYs, upcycled treasures and creative ideas. Hit subscribe, follow along, and I'll see you in the next project. Thank you for watching.